Haku, everyone, and welcome to the Power of Decolonization panel. My name is Luhui Whitebear, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling in as a diasporic Indigenous person who lives and works on Kalapuya lands and honor the ongoing relationships through family and community work with both the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians and the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde that the Kalapuya people from this region are primarily a part of now. For many people, decolonization has specific usage that at times can become performative. We hear things like decolonize the classroom or decolonize the workplace, but often do not ask ourselves what that really means or the connections to colonization's influences in our lives and in our work. For Indigenous people, decolonization is always connected to lands, waters, teachings, and our communities. There is no single way that decolonization is experienced by Indigenous communities, as we all have experienced colonization in specific ways to our nations and our peoples. At the end of the day, when decolonization is used as performance, it can destabilize the work of Indigenous people to resist colonial systems and oppression. Today, we have a panel that will discuss the power of decolonization. I'm the facilitator of this panel and may bring in some thoughts as well. And before we hop into the conversation, we're going to briefly introduce ourselves and tell a small part of our story as connected to decolonization. We'll come back to some questions once we all introduce ourselves. And as I said, my name is Luhui Whitebear. I'm an enrolled member of the Coastal Band of the Chumash Nation from Santa Barbara, California. And I also have Huastec and Cochimi ancestry from Mexico. I'm an assistant professor in Indigenous Studies at Oregon State University and serve as the director of the Kaguix Manaina House, which is our Indigenous-based student center on campus. Additionally, I'm part of the leadership of OSU's President's Commission on Indigenous Affairs and volunteer as co-vice chair of our local school board for the Corvallis School District. A lot of the work that I do that is connected to decolonization really starts morphing into what's called indigenization, which is centering Indigenous knowledge systems and presence in the work that we do, especially here on campus. Part of that work was helping establish the President's Commission on Indigenous Affairs, which was approved this summer. And with that kind of leadership on campus, it can seem like an uphill battle at times, but I'm always drawing from the knowledge and the strength of my ancestors and understanding all that they went through and their teachings that have survived colonization's impact so I can be here today. And so I'm trying to do my part here on campus and in the communities to really center the people whose lands and waters that I currently am around, and working really closely with the local tribal nations and ensuring their sovereignty is upheld through our work as a state institution, and also helping establish our Indigenous Studies program as well to help remind our campus as well as other campuses. We're a Research One institution and a predominantly white institution. So a lot of times Indigenous knowledge is viewed as not as legitimate as white scholars, much like other communities of color's knowledge systems are. And so working collaboratively here on campus to help center our knowledge systems is really crucial to the work that I do. I do that with a great deal of care and understanding that even as an Indigenous person that I'm living on another Indigenous people's lands. And it's always a constant negotiation of centering what their needs are while also bringing in the needs of the broader Indigenous community that is part of OSU. And so that's a small part of my work that centers on decolonization. And I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves as they would like, and to also share a small snippet. We're going to get into discussion questions, so you don't have to share your entire story in the beginning. So we'll go with Faith first.
Hello, everyone. It's such a beautiful honor to be here. I'm Faith Clark, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm an Afro-Caribbean immigrant, mother to neurodistinct, or some people would say neurodivergent humans. And I approach my explorations of decolonization through the lens of my own differences and my own history as a person who grew up on a colony in Jamaica previously, previous colony, and experienced it as just I knew what colonization was. I knew what decolonization meant for us in the islands, and then having children who don't fit. My son has autism. That's kind of prompted my question around difference and centering. And our journey as a family kind of created the path that I do work on now, where I work with organizations to help them think about inclusion in the micro, help them think about inclusion in their day-to-day practices, in their conversations with their team members. Because if we can't work it out in our minute-to-minute conversations, then there is actually no space in the workplace for my children. So my passion is creating space in the workplace for my kids, and I see decolonization as the path to bringing more inclusion into the workplace.
Thank you, Faith. Adalia, do you want to go next?
Sure. My name is Dahlia Kinsey. I don't use any pronouns, so name only. I am living in South Georgia. This originally was Muskogee land. I'm kind of near one of the trailheads for the Trail of Tears. So many people were displaced or violently removed that there's not much of a visible presence. So I look forward to being able to be in this space and hear other perspectives of what decolonization looks like to North American folks with Indigenous ancestry. And my work, when I focus on decolonizing wellness, the themes are about removing internalized white supremacy as a barrier to actually being well as a non-white person living in a country that is still so heavily influenced by white supremacy and all of the other harmful carryovers that we get from colonization. And even though I am a stolen person, descendant of stolen people on a stolen land, I think there's so many different ways in which people who are descendants of survivors of the transatlantic slave trade can also benefit from supporting other people who've been affected by colonization in different ways, since all of our freedom and liberation is interconnected.
Thank you, Adalia. Allison, can you go next?
Thank you so much. I'm Allison Tedford Seaweed. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a Kwakiutl woman living on and working on the traditional unceded territories of the Semeth and Matspi First Nations. My people are from Vancouver Island, so I'm far from there, but I'm grateful to be on these lands today. The work that I do is often around supporting organizations and having better relationships with Indigenous people, and looking at what true inclusion can look like. I also do work around language revitalization and cultural revitalization. I'm a language learner, and I'm fourth generation doing this work in my family. And my great-great-grandfather was a master carver who made potlatch masks when that was illegal. And so resistance and art and cultural revitalization is really a very strong part of my family and my practice.
Thank you, Allison. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of popcorn around. This session is going to be more conversational, and we can always build off each other and just bounce our ideas and enter in the conversation. And then when we're done with this question, we'll just move to the next one. So basically, the first one is, what does decolonization mean to you? And as I mentioned earlier, it means something different sometimes to folk. And so it would be good for our viewers to understand like what it means to you.
Well, for me, it means trying to identify the ways in which, in the present tense, we're being affected by the legacy of colonialism, identifying the ways in which it hasn't ended, and seeing where we have room to opt out, to push against, and to resist colonization. So, in a lot of forms in my work, I work in health equity and educating providers so that they can be aware that white supremacy is basically the status quo and it affects every area of our lives. So it's even affected people's medical training. So it needs to be addressed. And the way that a lot of us have received a revisionist version of history, sometimes it's not clear why marginalized people are still complaining about systemic oppression, but that's because people have really not engaged with the true history in colonized nations. So for me, it's two parts: becoming more educated about our history in the lands in which we live, and seeing how that history is affecting us and harming us now, and how the legacy of colonialism is ongoing systemic oppression and white supremacy, and how we can resist that in whatever industry or field we work in.
I think I would add to that that for me, it's about noticing where I have centered my knowledge as the knowledge and where I got the sense of my knowledge from in the first place. So, what do I know to be true, and where did I get that, and why have I defined that as the truth? And how do I notice that that's happening in the spaces around me? I found that the more I explore the effects of colonization, the more I see that someone's eliminated all the other bits of knowledge and made some particular bit of knowledge the true knowledge. And so I'll just give an example of a conversation I had yesterday with a psychotherapist for my son who has autism. He's 23. And she said, "Oh, he doesn't understand what your family is going through," because we were talking about a bunch of changes that our family has gone through. And I had this moment of, why does she think my son doesn't understand? I was like, oh, because he doesn't speak. So someone made the statement that humans express their understanding through speech. And therefore, because my son doesn't speak, he doesn't understand. And that implicit assumption woven through her knowledge informs which medication she prescribes, informs how she sees me and my own resistance to her approach, and whether she would complain about me or not to, other social services or whatever. And so for me, it's about training myself to be aware of that, and then helping other people notice when they are on the outside of the known knowledge and what they're trying to do to get on the inside. And often that's in teams and in organizations. And then when I am putting somebody on the outside of the known knowledge and then critiquing them for it, making them bad, especially making the right knowledge a moral imperative, and therefore the wrong knowledge being something that's bad. So decolonization for me is about this centering of knowing and making people good or bad because of what they know and where what they know came from.
I would say in my work, it's often around challenging assumptions and really interrogating industry norms and looking at where does that come from? Why do we do this? And really reflecting on the way we interact and the way we structure relationships, administratively or interpersonally, and looking at, in what way does this acknowledge other knowledge systems and other ways of relating, and what ways of being are being privileged in these situations, and why, and what can we do differently to include more voices and more perspectives, and leave space for what other people need. So for me, it's about looking at, ways to reflect on how we are together and how we can be together better in the future.
Thanks, you all. A lot of what I'm hearing, it's like helping decenter the status quo, what is considered the knowledge and the norms, and like understanding that those come from somewhere, right? So decolonization is helping us identify those, and sometimes people don't really know what colonization means either. And so there's tons of scholarship out there. It's also the first week of classes on my institution, so if you hear voices in the background, apologies ahead of time, y'all. But there's lots of scholarship out there about different types of colonization, and sometimes that's helpful for people to know, like, that there are different kinds. And a lot of times when we're talking about disrupting the status quo and resisting colonization and understanding like how what is considered the ultimate knowledge comes from, and even the norms that are created based on all of those, that is talking about resisting settler colonialism. So settler colonialism, when a group comes in and asserts their own knowledge systems, their own cultural norms, their own political systems, their own governing structures, all of these things as superior in seeking to replace what exists. And so that's where a lot of what you're saying is talking about resisting settler colonialism. So I think it's important for people to understand that, because sometimes some folk think of colonization as only creating a colony to control resources, when that's a big part of it. But when we're talking about systems, we're talking about a lot of times settler colonialism. And I wanted to point out something that Dahlia was talking about with white supremacy. A lot of times people conflate that with whiteness as an identity, when white supremacy itself is also a system that assists in a lot of settler colonial construction norms that are created. And so I want to make sure like viewers understood a couple of those points that were coming out as you continue to listen to the conversation. That way we understand where the conversation is grounded in and understand what we mean, because all over the world we all experience colonization, and a lot of what we're talking about is based here in North America, in this region. And so helping folk understand from even within this region that what we're talking about, I think, is really important. And so the next thing, you all kind of briefly touched on it, but if there's any specific examples, or if you want to dig a little bit deeper into how decolonization shows up into your work, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that too.
I could start there, because I just had the courage to do a series of conversations I called the Decolonizing Work. And for me, I was afraid of using the word decolonizing because, again, background-wise, Jamaica was a colony, and I am, as Dahlia said, descendant of stolen people. And my experience of colonization is different from Black Americans and Indigenous people here in the United States. And so there was a part of this centered knowledge that had me thinking I wasn't allowed to use the word because it belonged with Indigenous people and it belonged with other people. So it took some time for me to access that actually colonization affected multiple people in different ways. And my experience of it is one of many experiences. And specific to me, when I do work in inclusion and I start with this premise of creating spaces where people feel like they belong, I had to ask, well, why don't people feel like they belong? What's going on here? What would make my son with autism, a Black American of Jamaican, Caribbean descent, male who is neurodistinct, he doesn't belong. I know he doesn't belong, but why? And as I explored this idea, where there's actually something that says this is what's normal and this is what's expected. So I had a staff person who worked with my son from Mexico, an Indigenous person, and she said, in my culture, Jaden would be a shaman. And I was like, that's interesting. I wish somebody would treat him like that here. And so this idea that without changing the person, without fixing, without curing, without healing, he could have a completely different experience because people would believe something different. So I like, how do we widen that whole idea that what if we all were able to notice what we believe and widen that a little bit so that we could even include ourselves somewhere? Because in my exploration, I realized, oh, I have actually excluded myself by centering whiteness, by centering whatever the norms are. I've excluded faith from the ways that faith prefers to work from. And so of course I'm going to exclude other people. Of course I'm going to be elitist. Of course I'm going to lean heavily into my privileges because I don't even allow myself to see and accept all of who I am. So part of my work is having that really personal conversation with each individual, that we could actually broaden that and have a different relationship with ourselves, and then broaden that and be able to include other people in this new relationship we're having by shifting the centering of our knowledge, by decolonizing our own thought processes. And that leads to more effective teams, and it leads to greater belonging. Sometimes people are like, what's the ROI on that, Faith? I'm like, happier people, happier people. So.
Oh, I love the way you explain that you were leaving yourself out, parts of yourself. That was definitely my experience too. That the more I understood where a lot of my anxiety and depression, where the roots of that was, through personal exploration, through therapy, through more research about feminist theory and how the patriarchy was even affecting me, I could really see how it is normal for humans to internalize this toxicity. It's everywhere. It's in the messaging that you get from your family because they've had to do certain things to survive. And when you think of all the things that your ancestors went through, the fact that you exist right now is nothing shy of miraculous. But you also have to understand there were things that they had to do that we don't have to do anymore. But it takes analysis, it takes reflection to see where did some of these traditions even in our family come from. Like, what's up with the overwork? What's up with the nationalism or clinging to certain privileged identities? This desire for hierarchy, which is something that's deeply ingrained in the system of white supremacy. You can't just allow people to be themselves, and you don't encourage people to accept that you can exist with others without a hierarchy. And it really took time for me to see the connections. But the more I worked with clients with the awareness that how you're racialized and how people relate to your gender and orientation affects the way you're treated, which of course is going to affect your baseline stress levels, which everybody knows stress tears down the body, but that it also is going to affect what you believe is possible and what you believe you can ask for. And it affects your ability to accept all parts of yourself, which also negatively impacts health. That is where it all started to come together for me. And it took so much work outside of healthcare because the social justice vibes in healthcare are very weak. So you really have to go other places for this knowledge and this wisdom. And like you said, Faith, understanding that there's so many different ways of knowing and that we've been trained to only honor certain kinds of knowing. Understanding that, being able to internalize that was so extremely helpful because you're not really going to be able to heal inside these toxic systems because there are no tools for healing or acceptance there. It's literally countercultural to be doing the work that we are all doing. And one of my parents is half Jamaican, half Afro-Cuban. And so, wow, yes, I have felt a lot of that experience, but secondhand.
For me, I like to look at like what are the assumptions that are made when we look at like workplace interactions and the way workplaces are structured, looking at like how do we define family? And often those are, based on kind of a white heteronormative family structure, and they don't recognize or acknowledge, how other cultures do family and what's important to us. So I like to help people think about, like, why did we set things up this way, and what do we know to be true about how people have been impacted by colonization, and how do we need to leave room for things like social determinants of health and unequal access to healthcare. If you have an organization that has a sick note policy, are you disadvantaging people who are less able to access healthcare, who are already more time poor, who may face transportation challenges, all of these things. So really looking at, like, what are the practical impacts, and are we creating policies that are exacerbating that, and how can we remove barriers and acknowledge that these are things that we face, and really just looking at, like, is this necessary? Where is this coming from? Why do we believe this is how we should do things? And are there other ways that we can take better care of people? And really looking at, like, what are the specific needs? When I worked in the prison system, we had, a really great elder services program. But one of the things that we acknowledge is, like, there's so much diversity in faith. And so having, like, an elder is great, but it's more meaningful to be able to bring in people who are, aligned and have that specific knowledge of those cultural practices, right? That our faiths are not interchangeable, and that we need to leave space for that too, that we can't, like, treat things generically or from, like, a pan-Indigenous lens. So really looking at, like, how can we honor the uniqueness of these cultural systems, and create opportunities for people to connect with, and explore more deeply their values and their beliefs. So those are some of the things that I have done in the past and continue to do, is look at policy and programs and see how they can be more inclusive of different practices, and how we can decenter white norms and create something that helps more people.
I find that the question, what are the barriers, is such a helpful question, because we've, made the overworking in many marginalized people, the overworking, the burnout is about scaling these barriers. It's the work that we've had to do to kind of do what's needed, and it's been made to be a sign of character and moral fortitude to be able to scale these barriers. And so the humility of acknowledging a barrier as a person, say, this is a barrier to me, versus this is a flaw in my character that I need to overcome. That's how I thought about it for a really long time, and still have to struggle to not think about that. But just to say, this is a barrier for me. And then also to flip that around and say, what's the barrier to this? Sometimes I work with small private schools. What's the barrier to this teacher to do this thing? What's the barrier to this particular parent for this thing? Like, instead of, why are these people this way? Because when we start to look at what the barriers actually are, we get to see our centering, because the thing isn't a barrier to me because of my privilege. So what's the barrier for this person? I think that really is very helpful in the workplace to then wait to talk about accessibility and to talk about the practices that need to be put in place so that there is safety to be able to say, you know, this is actually a barrier for me.
When you said, Allison, that you look for ways or you question, is there a way we could do this better so that everyone can be taken care of? That willingness to reimagine systems and envision a world in which there is room for everyone, and that someone else's culture being celebrated doesn't mean a loss for anyone. That really is, that's the vision that I bring across the board in my work as well. But it takes constant reminding, because so many of us, because of our intergenerational trauma, there isn't a lot of existing systems that encourage intersectionality and collaboration, even though naturally humans are very curious. And you know that when you find out about another person one-on-one, you're usually like so intrigued by their family's quirks or their individual quirks or cultural quirks. But we have been trained to kind of be at each other's necks, and all of North America anyway. I hope it's better someplace else, but I'm not hearing that it's better from my internet friends. So it's really something you have to look at when you feel yourself maybe feeling a little triggered or charged when you think some other group is being centered but not you, especially if the other group is being centered because they're higher risk or more vulnerable and need more healing and help because they're facing additional barriers.
That's such a tool of colonial control too, is the focus on like being the main person or the one, or being now there's a train in the background. Oh my gosh. Some things we can't control in our backgrounds, but it's reminding me a lot of what y'all are talking about how there's tools, settler colonial tools that are used in to uphold these systems, and like focusing on the individual and focusing on being the one or the best. And it reminded me too what y'all were saying. One of my really close friends, and her dissertation was around Black women in higher ed, was focusing on the use of the superwoman schema on like always the self-sacrifice, and also there's also the like you have to work twice as hard as a woman of color a lot of times and things like that. I face that in my own career here, and so there's always those pieces, but pointing out the barriers, as you said, Faith, is something that I've found effective in my work here on campus too. Is like, I'm a single parent. I cannot make 8 a.m. meetings. So if you all want me there, you're going to have to change when those meetings are, or I'm just not going to be able to participate, and you're going to not get my input. And I'm not saying I'm the center of the universe, but if you do want me there, I can't be there. And so like pointing out like these very specific things that may seem like, oh, we're just making an exception for Lou so she can be at a meeting. It's like, no, how many other single parents can't go to these meetings at 8 a.m. because they have to drop their kids off at school? And there's a lot of that exists in society where there's a lot of fear of speaking up because you don't want to look weak or look like you can't do your job. And I know I've faced many times where I've been passed up on opportunities because I have needs like that, and have pointed it out. So it's really understanding the power of your own voice, and when you're doing that self-advocacy, you're also advocating for others in similar situations. And that may seem really isolating in smaller businesses or smaller organizations. I'm speaking from a Research One, predominantly white institution. There's like a ton of people that work here, so it's benefiting a lot of folk. But even if it's just centering your needs and you're the only one that is in that situation, it's benefiting everybody because you're able to be part of those conversations and those decisions. So yeah. We are, let's see where we were, 134. I wanted to I have a couple of questions that are specific to y'all's work. We've woven that in there quite a bit, of course, because that's the whole point of this panel. But I'm wondering, Allison, specific to your work that focuses on reconciliation, well, not all countries have committed to reconciliation with their indigenous peoples. That's like, there's far and few. That do you have that commitment like nationally? Why is it important for business owners to understand what that means, and how can they participate in reconciliation type efforts even if their countries have not committed to them?
Well, I within Canada, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there were a series of recommendations that came from that. And so, those are in progress, varying levels of success. One of the specific calls to action is around the corporate sector and the responsibility of business owners to participate in reconciliation by creating opportunities for Indigenous people, and by also educating their staff about issues relating to Indigenous people. So I think that as business owners, we're the ones who are setting out, other than like licensing specific things, but like we set these businesses up to meet, to fit with like how we see the world and what our values are. And if we value reconciliation, that's something that we can integrate into our business as well, regardless of whether there's a national commitment. There can be a personal commitment. We also have an ability to lobby as business owners. We build platforms to be able to speak about what we do, and we can use those platforms to talk about things that matter to us, and if reconciliation matters to us, and we have an opportunity to educate people in our circle who are either following us or connected to us by way of our business, to help them understand what needs to happen. So I think that there's opportunities for us to be able to be in better relationship. There have been so many challenges in the past in terms of relationships between businesses and First Nations, in terms of land access and resources, and all of these things, and the social impacts of industry. So we have, as much as we've seen like negative things, I think that there's also opportunity for positive things. And if we make that commitment and we educate ourselves about what is needed, and it's one thing to go into your meetings and do a land acknowledgement, but if you're not in relationship with those people on those lands, how meaningful are those statements? And really, if you're in relationship with people, the people of the lands, then why wouldn't you want to be honoring them in the work that you do and in the way you treat your people, right? Like, it would be disrespectful to have your business on the lands of people and not be ethical in your relationships with others. And so I think that that's something that's, I think there's room for change through entrepreneurship, through the corporate sector. And I think it should be a lot deeper than just, a diversity statement or a statement acknowledging the need for reconciliation, but should be tied to tangible activities and actually taking responsibility for making those changes, and being transparent about where there have been gaps and what can be done to improve things. So.
Thanks, Allison. Faith, you work with small businesses, and how has decolonization benefited the businesses you work with, like using your decolonial approach?
I think what happens a lot in small business is the constant culture flux. So they don't have the luxury of stability that large corporate entities have, and that's a real positive if it can be seen as a positive. Large corporate entities just don't change. as quickly as even their statements say they want to. So when a small business finds itself in that constantly variable state where they're constantly validating the market, constantly changing out their staff, there's an opportunity there to 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 help them see that they can really see each other and really integrate difference into a meaningful whole, because they're constantly in that creation process of who are we and what are we doing in the world. And so when they're trying to compare themselves to privileged entities with stable cultures, stable toxic cultures, but stable cultures, they can see this state as bad and something they should be moving away from. While when we can see that this is the opportunity to actually really see each other, to actually create the safety that we probably didn't experience in those entities, then the way teamwork happens can start to look magical. Because it isn't a linear kind of, when these people speak to each other and do this task, this is the productive outcome. There's really a synergy that's not quite explainable when people feel like they belong with each other, to each other, and feel grateful for that feeling. Then it's not really about how much you're not paying me, although yes, pay people, please. But it becomes about something that can't quite be calculated, that then creates the energy to work. So I do, without trying, people can get a little bit put off if I sound too kooky. So I am, but I'm trying not to center the knowledge that says what I'm saying is kooky. And I'm 8 years into a doctoral program and then just stopped. I decided that it was supremacist and it was stealing my life force, and so I've stopped. But education is a primary tool of, I think, of colonization, and I am also a product of that. So as I step into the spaces, I'm constantly challenging myself and then challenging them to release those norms and be able to actually be in synergy with each other, and to not have to know exactly why things are working well, but to really focus on being well with each other by really seeing each other and then really integrating. I hope that makes sense. So I think I also approach things like conflict and silos with that lens. Like if people are actually whispering in corners, if people are silent in meetings, I'm like, whose voice isn't being heard and why? Why is that person actually not speaking but speaking over there? How come they're telling me and not you? And I start to probe in the micro moments to help expose what's happening, why we don't feel like we belong with each other and to each other, to then see how that affects teamwork.
Great, thank you. And Dahlia, your work focusing on wellness, as you've brought up, and the impact of white supremacy culture influencing wellness for racialized people, and specifically, how have you seen decolonization help address some of those root issues you were mentioning earlier?
It's made a tremendous difference when individual people who are having that experience, the marginalized person, realize that what they have been blaming themselves for is not a personal failing. It is simply the totally rational outcome of having to live with these systems. Like the fact that you're more likely to be time poor, the fact that you're more likely to have all kind of social determinants of health not working out in your favor. When you go to seek care so often, because of how individualistic our entire system is here, the individual is always to blame for whatever's happening to them. And we generally are not encouraged to take into consideration that we don't exist in the vacuum and our body is doing the best it can in the environment that it lives in. And there's some things we can control. There's some things we can push against. There's some things we cannot change. And maybe it makes more sense to be celebrating what your body has been able to do, keep you alive, rather than lamenting that there's all these other things you think if you could change, your health would be transformed. And also helping people to look at the ableism that's underneath a lot of the pressure to be well in a very specific way. That it's been encouraging to see individuals transform. It's been interesting to see how many people with a lot of privileged identities have also felt more free to be themselves, to work with their body, to work with their environment, to work with other people who they should be experiencing like connection with, understanding that all of that is just as important as, you know, eating well, that it's just as important to feel connected and safe and to know that you belong in the communities that you're in. It's been really encouraging to see that it's helpful for literally everyone to start expanding your view of what is well and to get outside of the hierarchical way of viewing the body that most of us have been ingrained with. So if you understand that there is no such thing as an ideal body, that all bodies are worthy of love and belonging, and that health isn't something that you have to get, health and wellness, those are things that help you live your life the way that you want to. And you are the one who gets to decide what's important, and you are the one who gets to decide what isn't.
Awesome, thank you. You are doing such awesome work. I was just totally into. I was like, oh, I have to finish leading the conversation. I'm gonna ask you one more question that's related to one in the Q&A that I had prepared, and then we're gonna switch over to one of those ones before we. So we still have time for a couple more. But what are some ways you all suggest What are some ways you all suggest decolonization be centered in viewers' work? So there's folk watching this wondering how to center decolonization. So maybe like, what are some first steps for folk new at this, or if they're still kind of trying to figure it out, what are some ways that folk can incorporate decolonization into their work?
The first thing that comes to mind for me is trying to connect to the surviving descendants of the people that the land you're on is like actually belongs to, and seeing what systems are already in place to honor that. I mean, I know some people who it's literally part of their check, the way they handle their taxes. You know, a certain percentage is going to taxes. Well, you know, a certain percentage of your income is going, you know, to these people to whom the land actually belongs. And then also looking at the ways in which your organization or your work maybe isn't expanded enough to hear lots of different voices, because this is something you literally can't figure out on your own. You need other people to hold up a mirror to you to show you the ways in which you could do better. Like even when you said, Lou, that you identified 8 o'clock as a no-go for you, that's informative for me as a childless person. I wouldn't have thought of that. So you have to have other people around you to reflect the ways in which you are not making room for everyone, and to explain the ways in which you are perpetuating toxic systems that are carryovers from settler colonialism.
Yeah, I think this coming off of that, because 8 o'clock is a no-go for me too, and actually maybe even 9 o'clock, because my son goes to bed at 2 o'clock in the morning. And so I'm up until 4. And so I tend to say that I tell stories. I think this is part of how we can make it more front and center in our own work and in those spaces we're in. I tell stories, my own story, because there are people who can't tell the story, but I can. And I am comfortable talking about my life as an Afro-Caribbean immigrant mother of an adult male who deals with a chronic disability in this world where none of his identities are privileged. And so I think that being willing to share those stories of discomfort as much as you're able, as much as it feels safe to you, but being willing to listen to the stories without too much commentary, like allowing yourself to interrogate other stories and take them in. Like my aunt told me about when she was managing a department of the bank in Jamaica, and her primary discernment, her primary strategy was to stop in silence and say, God, what should I sell the currency at today? And then a number popped into her mind and she did it. And now I think about that and I was like, that's another great way of knowing. There's spreadsheets and then there's asking a question. I think there's stories that people have of effective ways of being that we just need to hear so that it balances out this idea that there's one way to know, one way to do, one way to be. Children can sleep in the bed with parents, and maybe children can be held and it's not bad parenting. And maybe for me as a parent of a child that needed lots of different things, I had to shed a lot and say, yeah, actually, I have ancestors who slept with children all together, like this whole thing that I'm pressuring myself around isn't real. And I think the more we do that and share that with others and listen to those other stories, it will make it real. And I think the last thing I would just say is every company, because I work in this space for business, most companies have something like inclusion in their value statement. So I tend to say decolonization is the pathway to inclusion, because clearly just saying we're going to include people hasn't worked. It's, we have a long history of it not working. Why hasn't it worked? Or because there's things in the water that we haven't acknowledged. And decolonization is the pathway. And the more we can unearth what's in the water, the easier it will be to figure out what inclusion should look like here in this space. Because inclusion in this space is going to be different from inclusion in that space. There's no one catch-all inclusion policy. So.
Yeah, I think that it's a good place to start in looking at, look at what is within your span of control. Where do you have flexibility to look at what you can do to help people that will still fit within what you're allowed to do in whatever role you're occupying, and see how can you be creative within policy? How can you make the circle fit into the square, and bring those pieces together? And also looking at our own values and beliefs, and really interrogating those things around professionalism, and how do we decide what is professional? What cultural systems are we privileging in the way that we decide if somebody is professional or not? Looking at a level of emotion in work, and whether stoicism is being centered, and what about cultures that value expressive emotion. So really kind of looking at how you relate to other people and how you interpret the behavior of other people, and really reflecting on if you're applying norms that don't consider how other people like to be, and kind of having better relationships with people in being able to understand them more, I think is a good place to start. Is that the personal is important. Obviously there are systemic issues that need to be addressed, but there are things that are within our span of control that we can look to as a first step, and really taking the time to educate ourselves about the barriers that people face who are accessing our work, and how we can make ourselves more accessible.
Awesome. A lot of what you all are saying is making me think about how we all have needs, and a lot of vulnerability comes into the conversation in doing decolonial work, and sometimes that is devalued. And I think I would add into the conversation that globally colonization has impacted everywhere, right? Whether it's about resources, land theft, the theft of people, there is colonization has been felt globally. So I think since there are people from all over the place, it's good to think about learning what the story of colonization in the areas in which you live and work is really important. So when I introduce myself, I know the story of colonization for my people in Southern California and my people in Mexico. And I learned the story of colonization here in Oregon because that's part of my responsibility as somebody who now lives here to understand the story of how colonization impacted this area, because it's different than it is just a state away in California or a country away, a settler colonial nation away in Mexico. It's different than how colonization was experienced in just other parts of Oregon for that matter. And so it's really important to learn those really basic, like what is colonization and settler colonialism's impact in the spaces we occupy, and how are we related to that story. So I know how I'm related to because of my mixed ancestry of both the colonized and the colonizer, and having ancestry of stolen peoples and all of the ways that colonization has impacted who I am. It took a lot of deep work, and I take that as a guiding piece to help me understand how to do the work in the context of where I'm at now, and understanding that colonization didn't end. And a lot of times there's a resistance to doing the work, and like, that was in the past, we are here now, or you all lost, we won kind of rhetoric that gets really oppressive. And that's just a reflection of settler colonial dominance, right? And so like, it's hard for people to understand that settler colonialism had negative impacts pretty much on everybody, because it's asking us to like shed our humanity. It's always been dependent on dehumanizing other people. And so a lot of times when we're trying to do that deep work in institutions and in businesses and in the community, it makes us feel really vulnerable, and people become really uncomfortable with having those conversations, and they get scared, or they just get angry, or they're just a little bit uncomfortable because we're asking people to imagine something different. And it's been ingrained on us so heavily, like you all talked about in the beginning, that this is what's normal, this is what is the way to be. And we forget that it hasn't been that way for very long. And so I think it's important that we look at those pieces, especially as a starting point of like, what is my story's connection to colonization? How has it impacted my family? What role did my ancestors play? Not to take the burden of what happened in the past, but to help with the healing for the future. And so that's a lot of the way that decolonial work can be centered. And when people are being vulnerable and sharing things and expressing their needs, is to not minimize that or make people feel like a burden too. That's another basic step that folk can take, is be like, okay, that makes sense. How can we make this work? Because there's always a way to make it work that helps support everybody's needs. And so we have a few minutes of overflow time, because there's a question in the chat that would be, this one we might have touched on. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything about people talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion often. What's one thing you wish people understood about decolonization at its basic level? I think we've hit on some of that, but if there's anybody who wants to add anything, I'll just mute for a second while I pull up the other questions.
That it literally would benefit everyone. There isn't just one group of people who stands to benefit from it.
I think that I would say that when you look at the words diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's a hierarchy there. Diversity is not a thing that we create. It's an outcome of an equitable environment. And the equitable environment is an outcome from a strong intention to create this new we, this new us, where people actually feel like they belong with each other. And that doesn't mean that it's easy to do at all, but the intention to wrestle with it and to kind of have the hard conversations and to feel the difficult emotions in the crafting of this space of collective belonging, whatever that space is the space that produces something that's more equitable, which produces diversity. And I feel that we've been approaching it in the wrong directions. Like, our numbers are off. Yeah, not really. That we actually don't know how to help create healthy environments where people feel like they belong. And so let's work on that, because otherwise we end up with tokenism and abuse and other types of things when we try to approach it from the other way.
Yeah, for me, I look at it from a perspective of like when we are so focused on like the metrics. I mean, it's important that we have awareness of the situation, but I'm I'm somebody who's a lot more interested in creating access to an industry and to make the space more accessible and welcoming, because like you just end up hurting people if you focus on that recruitment angle without considering the fact you need to be a place that people are safe to be invited to. And I think that that's something that really needs to be reflected on, is that we need to practice these things like responsibly, and to get ourselves prepared to be a place that people want to be. And yeah, I think that through decolonization, we can create a space that honors more people, and I think that's something that we should look to, instead of just trying to improve our percentages.
Thanks, y'all. One question that I had prepped that we didn't talk about, if you wanted to share, is if you wanted to talk a little bit about how you started incorporating decolonization into your work, because we've talked about the work that we do now, but not necessarily how you started incorporating it. Maybe if you wanted to share something that you ran up against in doing that, could be another thing to add in if you feel like you've already answered that question, which some of you kind of did a little bit. So yeah.
I'll say something that I ran up against, which I was surprised by, though Black Americans, when I shared it with them, weren't surprised. So I had to acknowledge I grew up as a really privileged person, as a majority in my cultural context, and also in a space where women had a lot of social power, even if not financial power. So in a workshop that I was leading with a primarily white team, as I vulnerably acknowledged my own tendencies towards supporting the patriarchy. So my examples of teamwork and effectiveness and so on were Jamaican males, because I thought I was sharing something cultural, and I realized that I could have made choices that spotlighted non-males, and I shared that in the session. Later in the session, one of the participants, a white male, kind of, it felt like an attack by text, attacked me for another comment unrelated that I made, and he really was very angry with me, and I was so puzzled, like why it was very strange. And when I shared it, people were like, oh, that's textbook, to kind of me in a position of power, as he would see it. I'm kind of sharing something that was vulnerable, giving me a weak spot to then exert this power in a public space. And everybody in the workshop kind of was very affirming by text. They were texting me immediately. But I just, in that moment, felt almost like a timeline back into 400 years of Black women holding themselves and screaming and crying. And there was a moment where it's like, do I want this? Do I want to be that person who tells the vulnerable story while challenging people to reframe their thoughts and taking up leadership as it's given to me in a particular space for a workshop or whatever, to feel this thing? No, I actually can just be taking care of my children, and so there is that moment of I do this for my children because I was like, I can handle a fair amount of oppression. I don't want this for them. And so I got into inclusion and diversity, equity, inclusion work, and therefore into decolonization because of them. I felt that was the side path in, but then to feel the reflection of vulnerability back on me in that moment, that took some like, do I want to do this? So
To get to where I am now, I needed support and spaces where I could feel safe enough to start taking more risks, because my big fear, what I kept bumping up against, was that there would be a lot of retaliation from white folks in my life and from Black folks in my life that are not intersectional or are homophobic, because I look at people who have multiple marginalized identities. Intersectionality is a big part of my work, and there are a lot of people who are not open to it yet, aren't open to intersectionality. So I really had to reconcile, like, what is my actual mission, life mission in my business, versus the fear that I was experiencing. And was I willing to compromise on what I hope to do, which is help eliminate health disparities for queer folks of color? Was I willing to sacrifice my work because of the fear? And then what could I do to address the fear and to help myself feel safer? And acknowledging that sometimes, depending on where you did come up, you may have a real embodied sense of fear around speaking the truth about any kind of discrimination, because you've seen other people be fired for it. You've heard stories of people being murdered for it. You may really have trouble committing to doing this work because there will be so much criticism and you will make so many mistakes in an open way that it really is sometimes a catalyst for growth that not all of us maybe were signing up for. You don't realize how much growth you're going to have to do until you're in it.
For me, my first job working in government was at the Federal Treaty Negotiation Office, and then Indian Residential Schools Resolution Canada. And as I became more educated about residential schools and what happened, and realizing that this was part of my family history that just wasn't discussed, it made me want to find a way to be helpful. And so that's why I ended up working in Indigenous services and just looking at, like, I'm in the position that I'm in because of, I was raised in a family that had money, and I had a lot of proximity to whiteness, and I'm very white passing. And so I have had a lot of advantages, and I would just like to be able to be somebody who creates more opportunities for other people who haven't had those advantages, and who, and I mean, advantages in terms of, like, it created situations where I ended up being more successful in a commercial way. And but I certainly feel that more proximity to culture and my people would be advantageous. But yeah, so that's kind of where I came from with it. And I found that there were people who felt that that I was successful because of being an employment equity hire or what have you, and that I hadn't, wasn't deserving of it, or there was just this assumption that that there was less qualification, or that somebody had expected less of me, and that I had advantages that I hadn't earned, and didn't have a right to be there. So I dealt with a lot of kind of racism around that, and that was difficult for sure. And I still do to a certain extent, but most of the stuff that I experience because I'm so pale is that people feel safe to say things around me that are just not okay, and that's really uncomfortable. But yeah, I think that mostly it was just looking to be able to create spaces that celebrate, a range of cultures and practices, and that create opportunities for all sorts of people who haven't had the same opportunities, and um, and just find ways that are more effective to be in relationship together.
Could I just add a comment? I looked at the question and I was like, I don't know if I said this ever. I think the easiest access point for me to decolonization and decolonization practices was through the lens of the places I'm not privileged. And I find that if you want to understand how it has affected you, I think we all have not privileged identities, regardless of how many privileged identities we have. I think that if we can just ask some questions around that, it'll open up insights that we can then flip around and say, wait, oh, so this is happening to me in this area. How am I perpetuating this? And you can turn it on you can turn it for yourself and ask that question. But I found that it has been harder for people to access it when they're purely looking, through their privileged identities. And the beauty of the world we live in right now is that everybody has even one not privileged identity that could be a gift to understanding how they are participating in colonial thought right now.
Thanks, Yoa. And I was kind of born into decolonial work and activism. It's kind of just part of who I am since I was in utero. So it's kind of hard to avoid in my life. But I've incorporated it in different ways throughout my life. And the more I learn, the more pervasive and apparent it became and how it impacts every single one of us. And while I was an undergrad, I'm a first generation, even high school graduate in my family. And so going to college was quite a privilege. And I started taking the ethnic studies classes offered at our university, the Native studies classes. And I cried through a lot of the material because I started recognizing what was impacting people I knew, like the stories told. And those stories had names in my mind attached to them. So that's where I'm talking about, like when we start learning the impacts of colonization on our own lives, even as somebody that has all of this background and this work and has family legacies of it, it's still important to continue to learn because obviously we don't know all the things. Even if we think we do, there's always more to learn. And so when I started learning about the ways that systems, I was like, that explains this family member, this explains this community member. And I started tying things together. It was really hard and it was really emotional. And so I wanted to recognize that was, but it was still so empowering to understand the root causes of what was going on within the communities that I'm a part of. And then, like I said, expanding and understanding colonization's impacts on everybody and recognizing this global web that has been created that thrives off the oppression of people and with the oppression of earth and the resources, and it's all interconnected. And in order to disrupt it, we really need to lean into the work the best we can. And you all brought up fear a lot. And before I close out, I'll say that has been one of the main tools of colonization throughout history is fear, whether through violence, through public example, or in more subtle ways in its current iteration of firing people, not promoting people, and paying people lower wages if they're doing this work. So there's a lot of ways that it shows up in subtle ways now, but it's the same tool, that fear. And so here on this campus, I was part of one of the groups of employees that weren't protected by a union and who every year had to get reappointed. So like cause too many waves, you might not get reappointed. And so we all knew that and still know that. And so there's a lot of those fear tactics that come into play where people are like, it causes mental health stress, and it causes that manifests into physical manifestations and all the other things that are associated with that. So I just wanted people to know that these things are really real, and they are embedded throughout the systems very heavily. And the more that we can recognize them, the more we can collectively work in dismantling those systems that are controlling our lives and each other, and devastating our ability to live on Earth because of all of the ways that it's being exploited. And so we are right at our extended time. Thanks to those of you who are still hanging on, and many thanks to our panel. Thank you for bringing your knowledge and wisdom into this space. We hope that viewers have learned more about the power of decolonization and ways that you can incorporate it into your work. Because really, decolonial work requires all of us to participate in it in order to help dismantle oppressive systems that impact all of our lives. And with that, happy fall, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.